Welcome to the New Medieval Ledger. I'm Samuel Dempsey. This past week has seen a remarkable development to the foreign policy of the Trump administration, with the military operation in Caracas that captured Maduro and has now brought him to New York to stand trial. There's been a lot of questions about what the plan is behind this operation. What is the plan for the days after, moving forward? Is this about oil, democratic transition, or countering illicit drug trafficking? To try and understand this, I spoke with Jorge Jraissati, a native Venezuelan and the president of the Organization for Economic Inclusion, a global coalition uniting youth leaders, industry experts, and policymakers. Its mission is to safeguard democracy by economic inclusion and opportunity, especially among the youth. Jraissati is also an economist and a researcher at IESC Business School for the Center of Public Leadership and Government. His research has been published in Economic Affairs, the Brookings Institution, and Foreign Policy, among others. His policy recommendations have been supported by institutions like the OECD and presented at universities like Harvard and Cambridge. We spoke about all these issues and unfolding developments around Venezuela, but we also touched on the history of how we got to this moment in the first place, and spent the second half of the conversation speaking about the weaponization of banking and the economic factor to living under the Maduro regime and how that will unfold moving forward. As well, the role of the EU. The EU has largely been absent, so we discuss what should the EU do to stake out its own position here. With that, here's my conversation with Jorge. So Jorge, thank you so much for being on the show. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Thanks to you, my friend.
So it's been 5 days since the capture of Maduro by U.S. Special Forces, where he was extradited to New York City to stand trial. This has come months after U.S. ramping up escalation, and the operation reportedly killed over 100 people at this point, including civilians and 32 Cubans. This appears to be a military operation conducted with a mole close to Maduro, but it's pretty unclear. What is clear is that there seems to be no real coalition of Venezuelans developing a plan for the day after with this Trump administration. Do you feel any different now than you felt initially after hearing this news 5 days after? And does this military operation actually change the situation for Venezuelans on the ground for the better?
I think it's important to emphasize that it is essential that we Venezuelans are part of this process and that we work with Trump. And actually, the administration wants to do that, because it's not only Venezuelans who are politicians, but it's also Venezuelans who are technical experts on how to rebuild the state, how to rebuild the oil industry, how to rebuild the country as a whole, because Venezuela has been destroyed. Most Venezuelans are celebrating this moment because something that you and your audience have to understand is that Venezuela, for the past 2 decades, have been every single year in worse and worse shape, economically, politically, socially. Imagine if you live in a place in which every year you go through hyperinflation. So your entire savings are gone. Your family business may have been expropriated, taken away by the state. You may have friends who have been political prisoners. All Venezuelans' families right now are divided because 8 million people left the country. We are a country of less than 30 million people. So all families spend Christmas in different countries, totally divided. So I believe that that's why there is optimism. That's why people celebrate the operation. And right now, of course, what we need to make sure is that this brings democracy and freedom to Venezuela.
So I want to get to that in a moment of the actual situation on the ground and what it's like to live under this regime. But first, kind of coming back to this operation and you know, what is the plan going forward? So what we do know to be kind of clear is that Trump has explicitly said that U.S. oil companies will return to Venezuela. He's even claimed that Venezuela's oil was, quote, stolen from the United States. But it's pretty much unclear after that what this really looks like going forward. He originally floated U.S. leadership and control of the country. Then Rubio contradicted that. And there's also talks of military occupation of just the oil reserves. Mostly now, what seems to be the case is a transactional deal with the current regime, with the vice president kind of being the main figure at the top of this. So this admin didn't plan for the day after, so it's hard to know, what really is going to go on from here. But this is one of the most resource-rich countries on the planet. How will Venezuela benefit from any of these potential realities?
You cannot jump to conclusions so early. So, for example, you have said the administration was not planning a day after.
Yeah.
But the U.S. government would have not taken this decision if they didn't have a plan. Whether this plan has been communicated or not, this is not something that has been publicly said. So I believe that right now it's very important to not jump into conclusions. So let's see step by step how things are shaping. And of course, where you see gaps in knowledge or gaps in good implementation, of course, you need to raise awareness about that and talk about that. But about the intentionality, I think we just need to step back because it's only 5 days, right? So
Indeed.
the most, I would say, precise planning or the most precise transition framework that has been proposed, it has been proposed by Marco Rubio yesterday. So if you saw Marco Rubio's statement and press conference, he laid down a 3-point framework in which at the beginning he mentioned the stabilization of the country through the distribution and the allocation of oil resources that Venezuela has been pressured by the U.S. through this blockage or the naval blockage, right? The second one is that after stabilization of the country is the rebuilding of institutions and security on the ground. And the third one is welcoming investors and welcoming a political transition in Venezuela. And I believe that the U.S. right now is proving itself that they are being effective. They were very effective on taking Maduro, something that many people were complaining or many people were not expecting that it would happen.
So that plan that Rubio has put forward, I mean, that is the most clear plan that we've seen, but we haven't necessarily seen that from the other parts of this administration. There seems to be kind of a disconnect and contradiction that is unfolding, which I think is why most are watching this unfold and a bit unclear of where this is going exactly. But we know Rubio has long invested, his career in bringing about the democratization of Venezuela, of Cuba, and so on and so forth. So maybe this plan will be the one that unfolds. But, to rebuild the institutions on the ground being part of that plan, as you know, that's an extremely difficult endeavor. Do you think that this U.S. administration is capable of doing that when you still have folks like Rodriguez who are leading the country and this military establishment that kind of underpins this regime largely in place?
I think the U.S. has been very clear that there will be a full transition in Venezuela, that they cannot allow to have factions in Venezuela that cooperate with enemies of the U.S., with Iran, with China, with Russia.
Yeah.
So Rodriguez is clearly on that side. At the same time, they understand that these people are the ones who have control in the country. So you need to negotiate with them. Those are the ones that you need to pressure. So I really think that that's the scheme and that's the place moving forward. When it comes to Rubio, he has been very clear. Trump has been, of course, with his own way of speaking about issues. He has also been emphatic about the importance of making sure that the American region is free from enemies of the U.S. So he's really bringing back the Monroe Doctrine to the region. So, but as I said, it has been only 5 days. I think it's very important to have prudence and to have some sort of patience, to, of course, monitor what's going on the ground, to analyze how things are unfolding. But there is a long way. This is 20 years of dictatorship in a country. You will not remove everything in 1 day or in 5 days. It's a process. And I really think that this process is not only on the hands of the Americans. There really have to be a partnership or an alliance between the Venezuelan people, the American government, and at the same time, those who are committed to do a transition in the private sector and in the public sector.
Yeah, and that's an extremely important point. And there's, folks like yourself abroad that are really doing the work to see this transition be able to unfold. But from within the country right now, we are seeing an extreme crackdown from the current regime on those that are collaborating or attempting to collaborate with the U.S. government. How do you see that developing? What will make it possible for this transition kind of more organically at the grassroots level to be able to unfold? And do you think that this administration is, without boots on the ground, really able to undertake this kind of endeavor?
Yes, that's the most interesting aspect, because most Venezuelans, inside Venezuela, they're the ones who want to celebrate the most a change. They're the ones who are more desperate for a change. But at the same time, they're the ones who fear the repression. Some journalists, I believe 14 journalists were put in prison yesterday in Venezuela. People are really afraid to go to prison if they post or support anything related to this operation. So the most important factor, so that way you have this organic transition in Venezuela, is the security support on the ground of the territory in Venezuela. Because you cannot have any kind of political or economic transition if you have these criminal groups still operating in Venezuela, if you have this drug dealing apparatus still working in Venezuela, if you have Iranians, if you have all these bad actors in Venezuela. The U.S. has to be involved in providing security in Venezuela. To what extent, this is something that the technical people have to provide, because you cannot imagine any transition without having the people on the ground ensuring that there is security for the people that will lead a transition government, or the people that will come back to the oil fields, or the people that come back, frankly, to even all the diplomatic spots in the country.
So I want to provide some context to the audience. I want to backtrack a little bit to what led to this moment with a short history. So in 1948, the Truman administration supported a military coup that overthrew Venezuela's first democratically elected president after only 10 months in office. The dictator who took place after attracted U.S. investment and awarded generous contracts to American oil companies. When he was later overthrown, Romulo Bentecourt returned to power, helped establish OPEC, and built a new Venezuelan democracy. But that democracy was one that excluded communist parties and depended entirely on oil revenue. So when oil prices plummeted in the 80s, Carlos Andrés Pérez implemented the exact neoliberal policies that he campaigned against, and the people rose up. His brutal crackdown, the Caracazo, killed thousands, shattered trust, and paved the way for Hugo Chávez's attempted coup in 1992, which ultimately failed. If there's any point in which this narration as well you disagree with, please address that after. But Chávez went to prison as a result of this attempted coup, but he became a hero. So after Pérez's impeachment, Chávez was released, ran for president, and won. At this point, you grew up during the Chávez era, which saw genuine poverty reduction, but also extreme authoritarian consolidation. And then came his successor, Maduro, with, immense economic collapse, as you've talked about, the U.S. sanctions that UN Rapporteur said has killed 100,000 Venezuelans, and now this American interventions. All of this to say, and please, address the issues you find within this, but all of this to say, this arc from U.S.-backed coup to now this military operation, what actually destroyed Venezuela and brought it to this moment of extreme desperation? Was it socialism, authoritarianism, U.S. influence, or, a combination of all of the above?
Right. Something that I think you really need to understand about the history of Venezuela is that the U.S. and Venezuela have been going hand by hand, but in a positive way. The way you described it before, it was that is the U.S. was somehow blocking democracy initially in Venezuela. It's not so much like that. The U.S. and Venezuela, they developed together through the 20th century, based on oil revenues, based on this oil partnership, but that brought a lot of prosperity to people. So from 1920 to 1980, Venezuela was the country who grew the faster of any nation in the world in terms of GDP per capita, 6.4%. And this was thanks a strong partnership between Venezuela and the U.S., a partnership that went through not only dictators, but also democratically elected government that were very close with Americans at the time. Americans were the primary business partner that we have throughout these decades. That's why so many Italians, Spaniards, Portuguese, they moved to Venezuela after World War II. That's why so many Colombians moved to Venezuela during the times in which Colombia was going through a lot of problems. So this partnership was really important and was really productive for Venezuelans and at the same time for Americans, because Americans had a reliable oil partner when they needed the most. The country that was supplying the American most oil during World War II was Venezuela. So in this sense, Venezuela was a beacon of democracy in the region. In fact, Venezuela was helping the democratization processes in the south of Latin America. It was helping democratization process in Spain. It was really a good actor in the region. And people in Venezuela were way more prosperous. You then talk about the issues. The issues in Venezuela began to some extent in the 1990s, but not because there was a collapse. Like the Venezuelan economy did not collapse those years. It's that they had 2 decades of very low economic growth. Economic growth of less than 1%. So Venezuela was increasing rapidly. And then 1980s, 1990s, there was a stagnation. When people's expectation rises way higher than people's reality, there is a lot of dissatisfaction. There is discontent. And people wanted a change. And that's why people voted for Chávez. But then the solution was way worse than any kind of problem that Venezuela had before. So Chávez inherited this Venezuela. Oil prices went through the roof during the Chávez administration. So Chávez and Maduro received, in a period of 11 years, $1 trillion in oil revenue. But despite this, Venezuela's poverty rate increased, Venezuela's inequality increased, inflation rate increased, shortages increased. So that's why Venezuelans, the 70% of the country, wanted Maduro out. And 70% of the country wanted Maduro out not last year, but many years ago, since as long as I can remember. Because he's the one that we should blame for all the collapse that we see in Venezuela.
And so I want to try to understand a bit clearer the distinction, because under Chavez was in many ways kind of a person of the people, and that was part of what enabled him to maintain power, right, for so long. He was able to resonate with all facets of society, despite all of the ills and the issues that he had, of course. Whereas Maduro is kind of an outside figure, right? And that's part of the collapse that happened, is he didn't really have any organic support even from the beginning, correct? He kind of was backed by Cuba and, other military kind of forces, but not necessarily by the people. And that's part of why he wasn't able to really implement Chavez's policies to the same degree, if I understand kind of correctly, the transition that occurred from Chavez, who had many issues, but also was liked by many, and then to Maduro, where things kind of immediately collapsed. It just kept getting worse over time.
Yes, there's two main differences, or I would say three main differences. The first one is that Chavez won election, and he won election not only one time, but more times. Yeah. He had support. He had this charisma with the people. The second very important factor was the factor of having money, having oil. With Chavez, the Venezuelan economy was booming because oil prices were going skyrocketing. At the same time, he was taking immense amount of debt. So Venezuela, the time in which it was receiving the biggest amount of oil, it was the time in which they were also getting the most amount of foreign debt. So every year, they were spending incredible amount of money, not only inside the country, but also outside the country, to do diplomacy, to build their connections with other nations. And inside Venezuela, they did it to establish themselves power, and at the same time to bring themselves a lot of popularity. When Maduro took over, first of all, he didn't win that election. So from the beginning, Maduro has been always contested by the Venezuelan people, who already wanted a change. When Maduro came to power, the government had already, the socialist experiment had 14 years taking place. So it was already a natural decay because people wanted a change in Venezuela and throughout Latin America. Those were the times in which the socialism in the 21st century was declining. So when Maduro took power, the Venezuelan economy was already showing signs of deterioration, because you cannot for too many years be borrowing at this amount of money. You cannot be expropriating so many companies without consequences. And you cannot be running this socialist economic policy. Maduro then started to crack down even more on people's will, on journalists. But all this process began during Chavez. Chavez was the one who started expropriating companies, farms. He was the one who started taking over journalists and TV channels. He was the one who turned a country that used to be a very peaceful country into a very violent country. So Venezuela used to have one of the lowest murder rates of the region, and it became the highest by far in the period of the Chavez administration.
And just kind of a brief note, it's something I've been trying to understand and can't kind of wrap my head around. Is why did Chavez choose Maduro as his successor? I think that was kind of surprised to everyone, even at that initial moment. Like I said, he didn't have much roots with the people exactly in that. And like you've mentioned now, then the election didn't go well for him right away. Why was that the decision that he made?
First of all, I think the election would have gone badly for any candidate. So not just Maduro, any candidate that the Chavistas at the time would have chosen, because the process was already deteriorating very fast. Why he chose Maduro? I have I would say a counterintuitive opinion here, that Maduro actually had a lot of experience in Chavez's government at the time. He was foreign ministry, he was vice president, I believe he was president of the National Assembly. So I think people underestimated Maduro for so many years. But the fact that Maduro was in power all these years also shows that he was not such a bad decision for them, for their own interest. For the Venezuelan people, of course, it was a horrible decision.
And so let's kind of look a little bit at how this Maduro regime functioned and maybe still will function depending on how these events unfold. So I want to talk about banking as a weapon, something that you've focused on very seriously yourself. The West debanked Venezuela as a country, cutting it off from SWIFT and global finance. But Maduro also weaponized the banking system against his own people, using anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing laws and financial surveillance to track opponents. So can you walk us through both sides of this? What it looked like when banking becomes a tool of control from both directions? And where does it leave everyday people with their ability to actually resist the regime?
Yeah, the problem in countries like Venezuela is that most people who do politics, nonprofits, activists, journalists, or even business people, they cannot have bank accounts. They cannot have access to financial instruments. Their assets are often taken away without
Mm.
any kind of judicial order, without any kind of due process. So that's the problem that people live in Venezuela, but they also live in Nicaragua. They also live in other authoritarian states. When it comes to sanctions, Maduro has been subject to sanctions since 2017. So the US has sanctioned Maduro because of his implications and his association with drug dealing. Maduro was indicted by the US. And right now, Maduro is facing justice in the US, which everybody who believes in the rule of law, that's what they want to see.
And so, kind of trying to understand then what people are able to rely on in working against the regime. According to a blockchain intelligence firm, TRM Lab, 38% of all crypto-related web traffic in Venezuela went to a peer-to-peer transaction platform. So this website became the financial lifeline for millions. You worked immensely in this, crypto kind of angle of this. Why did crypto work as a means to continue everyday life and have also opposition when everything else failed?
Yeah, Venezuela is a country in which you don't have banking system. So people don't have bank accounts. People's entire savings were taken away by hyperinflation. Access to dollars is extremely restrictive. So people went to the only solution they had, their bank of last resort, which was crypto assets, particularly Bitcoin and particularly stable coins, Tether, USDT. Through these instruments, people are able to make payments, do transfers, save money, and overall access their financial inclusion. Without these instruments, people in Venezuela will face enormous challenges, enormous difficulties, because the banking system doesn't work and because the Venezuelan currency is worthless.
Yeah.
So when people receive significant amount of domestic currency, the first thing they have to do is they have to try to sell it right away or to buy products right away. Because if they don't do that, in a week, the same currency will be valued 30% less or so. So that's why the crypto market developed in Venezuela from the beginning. So Venezuela was one of the first countries in which you saw much more adoption of Bitcoin, in which Bitcoin mining became a thing. And I really believe that the crypto assets industry and sector as a whole has to play a fundamental part in rebuilding Venezuela, in rebuilding our economy. Because people naturally need to have fast and reliable and modern financial inclusion instruments. And I think it will be a better way to rebuild our economy if we build it on top of these new layers of technology.
So before kind of getting into that rebuilding and where crypto will play its role in the future, how widespread was the use of crypto? I mean, trying to kind of visualize for an outsider foreigner who really doesn't know how the day-to-day life would look like economically within Venezuela. I mean, was it every shop owner or was it specific transaction? Like how pervasive is it within Venezuelan society?
Right now, everybody. So everybody who is a business owner who is doing transactions, they need to use crypto assets, especially stable coins. I would say that there is not reliable numbers, right? But I would say that 70% of the population, 80% of the population uses with some frequency crypto assets, especially everybody who is doing business is using crypto assets. It's just the way that you have to survive. If you don't use them, you cannot access dollars, you cannot basically operate in the country.
And so if this regime fully falls, like you said, the use of crypto has been a means for survival. If there becomes other options, if the economy gets relatively stabilized or if the US adopts some type of control and oversight of the country, how relevant will crypto be? And if crypto needs to be, like you're saying, a foundation to build upon, what would that look like in practice?
I believe the crypto asset sector has to be a foundation of the Venezuelan economy. How will this will look into practice? Banking system in most countries is extreme, in most developing countries, is very slow, is very expensive. The transaction costs are huge. The delays are huge. So if in Venezuela we have the chance to rebuild our country, we need to build it on top of layers of new technology, on top of what is really working. And what really is working is the crypto asset sector. So when we rebuild our financial sector or financial inclusion instruments, we need to take that into account. The second thing that I always emphasize is that people are naturally skeptic of currency in Venezuela. after all these years of hyperinflation. So people are really worried about their savings. People are really worried about inflation. So naturally, the Bitcoin sector will be present in Venezuela because people will demand it. People will want to have money that is protected from any kind of manipulation. Bitcoin mining, I believe, should be and will be an essential component of rebuilding Venezuela. Why do I say this? Venezuela is an energy hub, a lot of energy in Venezuela. People usually talk about natural gas or oil, but Venezuela has a lot of hydro. So Bitcoin mining can be an extremely profitable business sector, a booming sector in Venezuela, if we give them all the conditions for doing so. Because energy, the price of energy, the cost of energy, if you compare Venezuela to other countries, developed countries, is way cheaper. So if we give people the opportunity to do Bitcoin mining, I really believe will be an essential part of it.
So I want to try and also understand, because as you've talked before, this corruption is a deep-seated part of society as well in Venezuela by nature of this regime, which kind of abuses this corruption to benefit its own kind of cronyism within this. So crypto, for all its benefits of protecting the user and creating a safe and relatively anonymous currency use, also benefits bad illicit actors that want to do things in the dark. So how can you build this crypto use within society with this new democratic transition, hopeful in Venezuela, and also root out corruption that may be utilizing these same platforms for its own benefit?
Right now, if you want to build a good anti-money laundering architecture and anti-financial crime architecture in a country, you have all the tools of doing so. You have all the mechanisms. Actually, Bitcoin and crypto assets are very easy to track, are very traceable if you know how to use the mechanisms that the authorities have at their disposition. People usually link illicit finance with, for example, Bitcoin or crypto. But the reality is that throughout the world, most illicit finance goes through traditional banking system or any other mechanism. So it's really not a question of financial integrity or financial inclusion. I really think that you can do both. And the most important thing in a country is that you prosecute the criminals and you prosecute those who commit crimes. And in the case of Venezuela, when it comes to the security aspect, the most important thing is to identify and neutralize these cells of criminal groups, irregular groups that you have in the country. When it comes to the business in Venezuela, if you make the rules of the game clear and you bring integrity to the country, then by definition, everything will flow correctly.
So I want to close with that, you and I are both speaking here in Brussels today, and the US has roughly outlined its role here. Europe has not yet. So in that regard, what should happen next? Should the EU stake out a more clear position defending national law or supporting a democratic transition? And also, how should the transatlantic community be thinking about financial sovereignty and democracy as this develops?
Yes, I believe that the EU has to come to the side of freedom in Venezuela. I understand that it may not be an easy statement for many reasons. But the reality is that we live in a geopolitical moment in which you either support the people who want democracy and freedom, or you either support the people who want to destabilize a country like Venezuela or a region. Maduro has become a source of instability. Maduro has financed illegally many political parties outside their country. Maduro has destroyed a nation that used to be a good nation, that used to be an ally of the US and Europe, that used to welcome many, many Europeans. So I believe Europe has to take a stand in support of a transition in Venezuela. The role of Europe, I think, will bring even more stability to the situation. The values that Europe represents are values that I want in my country, the values of justice, rule of law, fair access to rights, and transparency. So I believe Europe can be a force for good. Sometimes Europe is a bit paralyzed because of the nature of the European Union. It's difficult to bring to the same position so many member states. But on this issue, I believe Europe should be at the forefront. When it comes to the economics of it, Venezuela can become a huge opportunity for Europeans who want to do business. And since Europe wants to stop its reliance on China for energy, not only oil, but also minerals, a Europe that is very connected to Venezuela and to Latin America and in support of the US, I believe is really important.
Well, thank you so much, Jorge, for being on. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New Medieval Ledger. If you enjoyed, please like, subscribe, and share to your friends, coworkers, and community at large. As always, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please reach out to me at my email, analysis@samuel-dempsey.com. With that, I hope to see you at our next episode.